Released in 1995 for the Super Nintendo, alternatively known in Japan as Dracula XX, and in Europe as Castlevania Vampire Kiss. A somewhat odd title considering there is little to no kissing found here, unless that's a European thing, I don't know. Castlevania Dracula X often gets a bad rap for not being the game everyone really wanted to play back in the day. You see, Dracula X Chino Rondo, or as most people know it as Rondo of Blood, was released for the PC Engine Super CD-ROM thing, and wasn't going to see the light of day around these parts for reasons nobody cares about. When word came around that Dracula X was going to make it over to the Super Nintendo, people were excited. And then they played it. And then people were not very excited anymore. People felt ripped off because they thought they were getting a Super NES version of a game that needed a CD-ROM to play. Or something. One way or another, Dracula X on the Super NES is a step down from what came before. Forget the fact that this is not the Dracula X people were expecting, because I think we're smart enough to think that there's no way they could have squeezed a CD-ROM game into an SNES game pack without making major sacrifices. But the unavoidable fact of the matter is that Dracula X is the second Castlevania to grace the Super Nintendo, the first being Super Castlevania 4, a significant evolution of the core gameplay and a fantastic video game in its own right. Without alternate paths or characters to fiddle about with, Castlevania 4 opted to give the player full control over his whip, whipping in 8 directions, flail it about, let it hang, latch on to floating hooks and swing across chasms or just hang there. This, along with improved jumping mechanics and the ability to crawl among other things, helped to make Super Castlevania 4 feel like a true progression for the series that would get dumped in favor of ripping off Metroid instead, for better or worse. Dracula X, on the other hand, feels more like a regression rather than progression, playing more akin to the NES games of old. Two-way whipping, pressing up an attack to launch sub-weapons, despite the stock SNES controllers bearing more than 2 buttons. No control over mid-air jumps, not even swinging across chasms, which is something that made its way over to the sole Genesis entry, Bloodlines, which is also an excellent Castlevania in its own right. And while I could sort of understand the omission of the additional whip moves, restricting the player to pressing up an attack to launch sub-weapons rather than map a proprietary button for this purpose is simply inexcusable. This might have been acceptable in Rondo considering the platform, but the Super NES gamepad had more than enough buttons that you could assign at least one of the bloody things to pull this off, or at the very least give the player the option to map the button themselves. There is no reason for a Castlevania game on a platform with more than 3 or 4 face buttons on its gamepad to force the player to press up an attack to execute a sub-weapon. Jesus balls. However, there are some additional abilities to Richter Belmont's repertoire, abilities that could help him save the damsels and defeat Dracula and all that stuff. Richter can now jump on and off stairs at his leisure, so you're no longer bound by climbing steps to avoid potential threats. By tapping the jump button twice, Richter can do a backward somersault that serves as a rather efficient evasive maneuver in some cases. And there's also a rather nifty item crash ability that, at a significant cost of hearts, enables Richter to perform a screen-filling attack that damages all targets on screen. It doesn't make up for what's been lost, but it is something different and distinct to Richter, and it is a step in differentiating these different Belmonts. Dracula X also lacks a lot of extra bits from the PC Engine version. You still have to rescue maidens to get the best ending in the game, but you can only do it as Richter Belmont. Maria Renard, a playable spammer in Rondo, is more window dressing here than anything. The game is generally a linear affair with only 2 deviations from the main path, one of which is crucial you avoid or else you're not getting any love. No, really, don't fall in this pit or else you're getting the worst ending. And while we're at it, don't lose this key or else you're not opening this door and you're not saving your girlfriend. And you're getting a mediocre ending. Unless you skipped on Maria, in which case, why even bother? There's no save function or level selectability, but you do have a password system. That's gotta be worth something, right? Right? Dracula X, to the surprise of absolutely nobody, is a rather difficult game, Some of it has to do with some notable quirks, such as a short window of invincibility that will leave Richter susceptible to getting whacked several times in a row, and it doesn't help that each hit often takes a good chunk of health away, so don't be surprised if you jump into a situation that sees your health wither to nothing in a short amount of time. Some of it has to do with level design and enemy placement. This game seems to have a massive hard-on for Spear Knights and Bone Pillars because these fuckers show up in droves at various points in the game, usually overwhelming fools who rush in like idiots. Another thing that Dracula X has a hard-on for, Bottomless Pits. Bottomless pits and moving platforms. Don't be surprised if you get knocked back into a pit more often than not because they're everywhere. Even Dracula has pits. This whole game is the pits. Just like my pachinko machine. Wait, I don't have a pachinko machine. Wait. Because of Richter's reduced mobility and relatively slow speed, the platforming in Dracula X ends up being aggravating and the enemy placement doesn't help matters much. Some jumps are so tight that you almost need to walk off a platform to make the jump successfully. And if this sounds familiar, it's only because this was also the case in the first Castlevania adventure on Game Boy. Although, to be fair, Dracula X does feel a bit more speedier than the first adventure game did, so. Though only spanning 7 levels and 2 alternate levels for a total of 9, these levels feel a bit long in the tooth, at times feeling like they're lasting forever and could have been split into 2 separate levels. You do have checkpoints though, so that alleviates the pain a bit. And if there is a bright side to Dracula X, it's that there's no time limit, so you could take your sweet ass time navigating these levels and avoiding all the pitfalls. And unlike Bloodlines, you do have unlimited continues, so there's that. For the most part, the majority of the visual art of Dracula X is new stuff drawn from scratch. New level designs, new intermissions, new endings, that sort of thing. The only elements taken from the PC Engine original are the various character sprites, and they make the transition from one source to another in relatively decent shape. There might be instances of missing frames of animation or missing colors here and there, but for the most part, they blend in with the rest of the game rather well. As far as the rest of the game goes, the levels themselves look pretty good in terms of the aesthetics, and there's some rather neat touches like the flame effects in the burning village, or the subtle hint of sunlight illuminating the beginning of the second stage. However, there are cases where backdrops seem to possess somewhat muted or muddy colors, especially in the cavern levels. Now, is Dracula X as rich looking as Rondo or as mood setting as Vania 4? No. Compared to those games, this feels like a somewhat lesser form, but on its own, it's a rather good looking game. Save for the cutscenes, I honestly don't care for those cutscenes. Not a fan of that art style, to be honest with you. In terms of sound, Dracula X sounds actually pretty good. Obviously, a good chunk of the soundtrack is simply recycled tunes from Rondo, with some choice original stingers here and there, but you'll recognize most of the familiar bits, which includes remixes of older Vania tunes like the traditional Vampire Killer or Bloody Tears tunes. Now, brace yourselves, because what I'm about to say might seem blasphemous to some, but I'm gonna say it anyways. I actually think the SNES interpretations of these tunes sound better than the original PC Engine version. Maybe it's the streaming, maybe it's the instrumentation, I don't know. There's an element to this version's soundtrack that feels more natural and energetic compared to the original version, which more often than not felt more like one of those second-rate remix albums being played with a weird echo effect. I don't know, I just like the way the songs sound here than in the other version. That's just me though. Sound effects are also a step above the PC Engine versions. It certainly sounds more satisfying to snap that chain whip against a hapless skeleton and watch it shatter. Generally speaking, the sound effects all sound better here than in the other version, especially since they sound like real sound effects and not tinny 8-bit sound effects. And while this SNES version lacks any semblance of voice acting, I think it's safe to say we're not missing much here. If there was a single word that properly described Castlevania Dracula X on the Super Nintendo, it would be underwhelming. Underwhelming when it comes to being a follow-up to the previous SNES offering and offering far less than that earlier effort. Underwhelming when it comes to being a spin-off of a game that people really wanted to play, but couldn't because they didn't live in Japan at the time. Underwhelming when it comes to offering a new Castlevania adventure overall. On its own merit, Dracula X is a fairly competent Castlevania adventure. It's playable to a point, sports a superb soundtrack, and has a nice visual style. but also has a tendency to be a pain in the ass, not only in terms of the challenge level, but also in terms of the various gameplay quirks that makes this a frustrating affair. It's more or less a serviceable, maybe even a decent Castlevania adventure on its own, but compared to those that have come before, it falls short of greatness and doesn't stand out from the pack. For Castlevania enthusiasts, Dracula X serves as little more than a footnote addition, albeit a rather costly footnote addition to the collection. But if you're really curious about this one, you could probably get it for far cheaper off the Wii U Virtual Console. It's not bad for what it is, but not exactly a high point in the Castlevania franchise. Look on the bright side, it's not a fucking pachinko machine. Good night.